Stop for a second. Think about the last time you explained something to someone who hadn't even asked you anything. You said, I did it this way because the situation was actually, you understand, I didn't mean to. And the moment you finished talking, did you feel better? No. You felt drained, slightly humiliated, as if you had handed something of yourself to someone who didn't deserve it. Here's the paradox nobody teaches you. The more you justify yourself, the more you lose, not only in the eyes of others, especially in your own. And the most terrifying part? You do it every single day without even noticing. At work, with family, with friends, with your partner, with yourself, standing in front of the mirror at 3 a.m, mentally replaying a conversation that ended hours ago. You're still looking for the right words. You're still building the perfect defense. You're still hoping that somehow someone will finally understand. But nobody is listening, except you. And even you, deep down, don't really believe it. This video is not for people who want to learn how to defend themselves better. It's not a manual on how to respond to attacks or win arguments. This video is for people who want to stop feeling the need to defend themselves at all. Because when you reach that level, everything changes. The way you speak, the way you carry yourself, the way people perceive you, and most importantly, the way you perceive yourself. Stay with me. What you're about to hear might be one of the most liberating things you listen to this year. Let's start from the foundation. Why do we justify ourselves? The surface answer is to be understood. The real answer is much deeper and much more uncomfortable. We justify ourselves out of fear. Fear of being judged, fear of being abandoned, fear of losing the approval of someone who, deep down, matters to us perhaps more than they should. Think back to when you were a child. If you did something wrong, the first thing you learned to do was explain yourself. Explain the why. Find an acceptable reason. Search for that small window of understanding in the eyes of a parent, a teacher, an adult who had power over you. And it worked, at least sometimes. So you learned, if I explain myself well enough, I avoid punishment, I avoid rejection, I avoid pain. This mechanism built up over time, layer after layer, year after year, until it became automatic, invisible, a reflex response that fires before you even realize it. But there's a massive problem with all of this. As an adult, the rules of the game have changed. You're no longer a child who depends on someone's approval to survive. You're a whole person, capable, with your own resources. Yet you keep behaving as if your security depended on what others think of you. And that is the trap. Psychology calls it emotional dependency, but it's not the romantic dependency you read about in self-help books. It's something more subtle and more pervasive. It's the chronic need to be seen in a certain light, to be approved, to be understood. And when this need takes control, every action you take starts revolving around one single question. What will people think of me? Not what do I want, not what is right for me, but how will others see me if I do this? This question, when it becomes the filter through which you make every decision, slowly drains you. It makes you dependent on something you cannot control. It makes you a slave to other people's judgment. And justifications are the most visible symptom of that slavery. Every time you justify yourself without anyone asking, you're essentially telling the world, I need you to approve of me. I need you to understand. I need your consent to feel okay with myself. Take a moment. Let that sink in. Because if that's true, and for most people it's partly true, then you are building your emotional stability on ground that doesn't belong to you, on ground that can collapse at any moment, as soon as someone decides not to understand you, not to approve of you, not to give you what you're looking for. And that isn't living. That's surviving, waiting for the next judgment. Let's talk about something you've probably never considered from this angle. Every time you justify yourself, you're sending a message, but not the message you think. You believe you're communicating, I'm a reasonable person and I can explain my choices. But what the people around you perceive, consciously or not, is something very different. They perceive insecurity. They perceive neediness. They perceive that you're not entirely convinced of what you did. And this creates a devastating paradox. The harder you try to convince someone you're right, the more that person starts to doubt you. Because someone who's truly confident doesn't feel the need to convince. Someone who knows who they are doesn't need to be understood by everyone. Imagine two different people answering the same question. Someone asks, "Why did you make that decision?" The first person answers, "Look, I've thought about it a lot, and actually, I had several options, but considering the situation was pretty complex and I didn't want to risk making a mistake, I thought that maybe the best choice would be, well, you understand what I mean, right?" The second person answers, "Because it was the right choice for me." Full stop. Who do you respect more? Who seems more solid, more reliable, more trustworthy? The answer is obvious, yet we keep behaving like the first person, convinced that explaining more makes us more credible. It doesn't work that way. Excess words don't add value, they subtract it. There's a principle in communication called over-explanation, and it has a precise effect on how others perceive you. The more you talk to justify yourself, the less your words carry weight. Think of gold. Gold is valuable because it's rare. If it were everywhere, it would be worth nothing. Your words work the same way. When you use few of them, with precision, they have weight. When you pour them out in rivers of anxious explanations, they become background noise that nobody truly listens to. And there's another aspect that few people consider. When you constantly justify yourself, you are also teaching others how to treat you. You're telling them, implicitly, that they can question you, that they can test your decisions, that they have the right to approve or disapprove of your choices, that their judgment has power over you. And people, even those who love you, adapt to that dynamic. They start treating you as someone who needs to be approved. They start evaluating your choices instead of respecting them as yours. It's not their fault. You were the one who established that rule of the game. The good news is that you can change it. Not tomorrow, now. With the next conversation, with the next situation where you feel the urge to explain yourself and choose instead to stay still. I want to take you back 2,000 years. Epictetus was a slave, not metaphorically, literally a slave in the Roman Empire. He had no freedom of movement, no property, none of the fundamental rights we take for granted. Yet, he became one of the most influential philosophers in Western history. Why? Because he had understood something fundamental about the nature of freedom, something that most free people never grasp. Freedom, said Epictetus, does not depend on external circumstances. It depends on what you choose to do with your mind, with your response to things, with your inner alignment. A man can be physically enslaved and mentally free. Another can have everything, wealth, power, respect, and be internally enslaved to the opinions of others. And among many things he left us, there is one sentence that hits me square in the chest every time I read it. Don't explain your philosophy, embody it. 4 words, but inside those 4 words lives an entire system for life. Don't explain who you are, show it through your actions. Don't convince others of your reasons, live in a way that's consistent with them. Don't seek approval, seek alignment with yourself. Epictetus wasn't saying we should be closed, arrogant, impermeable to relationship. He was saying something far more sophisticated, that someone who is centered doesn't need to prove anything, because inner certainty is visible, it's felt, it's perceived, not through words, but through the way you walk, the way you speak, the way you decide, the way you sit in silence without feeling uncomfortable. There are people who walk into a room and say nothing, yet the entire room notices them, not because they've done anything special, but because they radiate something solid, something present, something that doesn't need anything. And then there are people who walk into that same room and immediately begin explaining themselves, introducing themselves, justifying their presence, and paradoxically, the more they do it, the less attention they receive.
The difference between these two people isn't talent, isn't intelligence, it isn't even life experience. It is inner peace. The peace that comes when you stop looking for confirmation outside and start building it inside. I also want to mention Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who governed an empire and still found time to write to himself, to remind himself to stay anchored to what truly matters. In his Meditations, he writes, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." This isn't selfishness, it's precision. It's the understanding that the only person you have true influence over is yourself. And when you focus on that influence, instead of wasting energy trying to control what others think of you, your life changes radically.
Because something strange and beautiful happens when you stop worrying about being understood. You finally begin to understand yourself. You start to feel what you actually want. You start to distinguish your own inner voices from the ones you borrowed from other people. You start building a sense of self that doesn't depend on what the world thinks. And that is the foundation of everything else. Not all justifications are equal. Some are more subtle, more hidden, harder to recognize, and for that reason, far more dangerous. I want to describe the three main types. As you listen, observe honestly which one you recognize most in yourself. The first type, preventive justification. This is the most common. It's when you justify yourself before anyone has criticized you, before anyone has asked you anything. Yeah, I bought that thing, but I waited a long time before deciding, and I actually really needed it because nobody asked you anything, but your nervous system has already fired into defensive mode. What does this justification tell you? It tells you that inside you, there's already a harsh judge, a voice that criticizes you before anyone else does, and you're trying to silence that voice by explaining yourself, as if by finding the right words, you could finally convince that inner tribunal that you are enough. But that voice doesn't go silent with explanations. It goes silent with self-compassion, with acceptance, with the daily practice of not needing to be perfect to deserve respect. Yours first of all. The second type is compensatory justification. This one emerges in moments of conflict. Someone expresses disappointment, criticism, or even just a different opinion, and you react by explaining until you feel physically exhausted. But I didn't want to hurt you, It's just that the situation was like this, and you weren't there when X happened, and if you also consider Y, then you'd understand that I couldn't have done otherwise, and besides, you also did Z. This type of justification is a way of fleeing from conflict, an attempt to resolve emotional discomfort through words instead of through real relationship, the kind that requires presence, listening, and the ability to sit with uncertainty without filling it with explanations. The problem? It resolves nothing. The other person feels overwhelmed. You feel humiliated. And the conflict, instead of being addressed, gets buried under a pile of words nobody truly heard and that will resurface sooner or later with even more force. The third type is identity justification. This is the deepest and most painful one. It's when you justify yourself not for a single action, but for who you are. I'm just like this. I can't help it. You know what it's like growing up in a family like mine. You know what I've been through. Here, you're not just explaining a behavior. You're using explanation to avoid the responsibility of change. You're using the past as a shield against the present. And the paradox is devastating. The more you justify who you are, the less space you create to become who you could be. The past is real. The wounds are real. Difficult circumstances are real. Nobody denies this. But there's an enormous difference between understanding where you come from and using it to avoid having to change. Understanding sets you free. Justification keeps you imprisoned.
Recognizing which of these three types resonates most with you is already an act of courage, because awareness is always the first step. Now we get to the part you've probably been waiting for since you started listening. Understanding the mechanism isn't enough, you have to change it. But before I give you the practical tools, I want to tell you something important. Stopping justification doesn't mean becoming cold. It doesn't mean never explaining anything. It doesn't mean ignoring others or locking yourself in your own tower and calling it strength. It means something much more subtle. Learning to distinguish between authentic explanation and anxious justification. Authentic explanation comes from a place of security. You give it because you want to share, not because you need to be approved. You can give it or not, and either way, you're fine. Anxious justification comes from fear. You give it because you need the other person to tell you it's okay, that you're right, that you're a good person. Without that confirmation, there's discomfort. This distinction between sharing and seeking approval is the key to everything. Now, the tools. First, learn the power of silence. Silence is uncomfortable. We've been conditioned to fill it with words, with sounds, with explanations. But silence, used with intention, is one of the most powerful forms of communication that exists. When someone criticizes you or asks a question that feels like an attack, try to do one thing: breathe. Don't respond immediately.
Let silence occupy the space for a few seconds. This does two things. First, it gives you time to choose your response instead of just reacting. Second, it communicates to the other person that you're not scared, that you don't need to defend yourself in a rush, that you're secure enough to take a moment. Try it today. In any conversation, when you feel the urge to justify yourself, stop, breathe, then consciously choose whether to do it or not. Second, replace justifications with statements. Instead of, "I did it this way because, the situation was complicated and I didn't want you to think that," try, "I made a choice. It was my choice." Instead of, "I didn't mean to be rude, but you understand, I needed to," try, "I needed that space." Notice the difference? Statements don't seek approval. They don't apologize for the existence of your choices. They declare them as real, legitimate, yours. And this difference in tone, small on paper, enormous in reality, completely changes how people perceive you. Third, recognize your triggers. There are people, situations, and contexts that activate the justification mechanism in you more than others. Maybe it's your mother, maybe it's your boss, maybe it's your partner, maybe it's a stranger on the internet. It's not a coincidence. These triggers are windows into deeper wounds, into aspects of yourself that still seek approval from someone specific, or a version of someone from your past that the trigger reminds you of. Identifying them doesn't automatically resolve them, but it gives you an enormous advantage. Instead of reacting, you can observe. You can say to yourself, here it is. This is the moment where I usually justify myself. What do I choose to do this time? That pause between stimulus and response is where your freedom lives. Fourth, build your inner circle. Instead of seeking approval from everyone, start building a selective internal evaluation system. Ask yourself every time you feel the need to justify yourself, is this person in my inner circle? Does their judgment truly deserve to influence the way I show up in the world? Brené Brown talks about keeping a small piece of paper with the names of the only people whose judgment she genuinely values. People who truly know her, who love her with her flaws, who are present in her struggles. If the criticism doesn't come from those people, the judgment doesn't deserve to guide her choices. This isn't arrogance, it's discernment. The ability to distinguish between valuable feedback, the kind that helps you grow, and noise, the kind that only asks you to conform. Fifth, embrace being misunderstood as part of life.
This is the hardest one, and the most liberating. Some people will not understand you, not because you did something wrong, not because you didn't explain yourself enough well, but because they don't have the tools, the openness, or sometimes even the willingness to understand who you truly are. And chasing them with explanations, in that desperate attempt to finally be understood, is like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it. You can pour all the water you want, it will never fill up. You can spend years explaining yourself to someone who has no intention of understanding. And during those years, who are you neglecting? Yourself, your growth, the relationships that actually deserve your energy. There is a deep peace that comes only when you accept this truth. You don't need to be understood by everyone. You need to be at peace with yourself. I want to tell you about what exists on the other side of this change. Not in a theoretical way, in a concrete way. Because everyone who has gone through this process describes it the same way, like a lightness they didn't know they could feel, like taking off a backpack they had carried so long they had forgotten it was there. When you stop justifying yourself, you stop carrying a weight that was never yours. That weight is made of unspoken expectations, of other people's demands that you made your own, of that constant exhaustion of managing how others perceive you, of that relentless inner voice saying, "But what will they think of me? Did they understand? Did I say the right thing?" When you stop justifying yourself, that voice doesn't disappear immediately, but it fades. And with it fades that chronic tension that so many people carry in their body without even knowing it's there, in the shoulders, in the jaw, in the tightness in the chest. The second thing that changes is your relationships. Paradoxically, people start respecting you more, not because you've become distant or difficult, but because you radiate something rare in the world we live in, the quiet authority of someone who knows who they are. People feel this quality. They recognize it, and in its presence, they adjust. They don't test you the same way anymore. They don't try to make you change your mind about yourself.
Because they can see that you've already answered that question, internally, steadily, without needing to prove it. And relationships become cleaner, less loaded with hidden power dynamics, more authentic. Because when you don't need approval, you can finally choose people for who they are, not for what they give you. The third thing that changes is your relationship with yourself. And this is the most important one. When you stop seeking approval outside, you are forced, in the most beautiful sense of that word, to build it within. To look at yourself honestly, to recognize your values, to understand what you truly want, not what you think you should want, to choose authentically. It's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. But every day you make this choice, every time you feel the urge to justify yourself and choose instead to stay grounded in yourself, you are building something precious. You are building integrity, not integrity as an abstract moral concept, but integrity as integration, becoming a whole being, consistent with yourself, not fragmented by the need to please everyone. And then there is freedom, true freedom. Not the kind we imagine, doing whatever we want, whenever we want, without consequences. That doesn't exist. True freedom is this: not needing the world to be different from what it is in order to be okay. Not needing people to understand you in order to feel valid. Not needing anyone's approval to act in accordance with your values. This is what the Stoics called eudaimonia, a word we translate as happiness, but which actually means something closer to flourishing, living fully in alignment with your best self. And that best self has no need to justify itself, not because it's perfect, but because it's authentic. I want to close with something different. Not another theory, not another practical tool. I want to invite you into an exercise that, if you actually do it, not just think about it, but do it, could leave something in you permanently. Imagine writing a letter, not to someone who hurt you, not to someone who didn't understand you, to yourself, right now, as you are, not as you wish you were. In this letter, write one thing only: all the justifications you most need to let go of.
not to show anyone, but to see them written down. Because when we see them written, they stop being fog and become form. And what has form can be examined, can be questioned, can be released. Maybe you'll discover you're still justifying yourself for a choice you made 10 years ago, for a relationship that ended badly, for a career you didn't pursue, for a dream you abandoned halfway through, convinced you weren't enough. Maybe you'll discover you're still justifying yourself to your parents, even if they're not present in today's conversation, even if they're no longer here, even if they never asked you anything, because that voice asking you for explanations now lives inside you, not outside. Maybe you'll discover that the person you justify yourself to most often, most harshly, most relentlessly is not your partner, your boss, or your friend. It's you. You are the one who questions yourself more than anyone else does. You are the one who never gives yourself enough credit for what you've been through, for what you've built, for who you've become in spite of everything. And if that's true, and for many people it is exactly true, then this is the most important work you can do. Not stopping justifying yourself in front of others, stopping justifying yourself in front of yourself. Because when that inner voice stops demanding constant explanations from you, when you start treating yourself with the same kindness you would give to a friend you truly love, when you stop having to earn your own respect every single day, something opens up. Not dramatically, not with fireworks or blinding revelations, but in a real way, stable, lasting. A quiet that doesn't depend on what's happening around you, a certainty that doesn't need to be proven, a peace that needs no permission. Epictetus was a slave and found this freedom. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire and every morning reminded himself to look for it within, not outside. Both are telling us the same thing across 2,000 years. True peace doesn't come when others understand you. It comes when you stop explaining yourself, to them, and above all, to yourself. We've reached the end, and if you've stayed until here, it's because something in what you heard was true for you. Maybe uncomfortable, maybe liberating, maybe both at the same time. Take one thing with you from this video, just one, the one that resonated most for you, the one that feels most urgent for your life right now. And tomorrow, in a real, concrete situation, put it into practice. You don't have to change everything. You have to change something, once, today.
If this video gave you something of value, do 3 simple things. Leave a like, not for me, but to help this content reach someone who needs it right now, at this exact moment in their life. Write a comment. Tell me, what is the justification you most need to let go of? Write it down below. Not for me, for you, because naming it is already the first step towards releasing it. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Every week I publish content like this. Reflections that go deep, that don't tell you what you want to hear, but what you need to hear to truly grow. Because this channel isn't built on easy answers, it's built on honest questions, and on people, like you, who have the courage to face them. See you in the next video.